Hello everyone, this is the second Q&A video where I answer viewers' questions. A little channel update first. My last video was about the writing in the Latin script on folio 116v. We looked at it from a purely paleographical angle, dating the handwriting to the early 15th century and placing it somewhere around the cities of Fulda, Mainz or Zurich. Understandably, the question I got most was, well, this is the manuscript that nobody can read, and there's text in it that we should be able to read, so what does it say? The short answer is that after a century we still don't know. The long answer is that I'm working on it right now for my next big video. This involves a lot of new research, talking to relevant specialists and so forth, so it's taking me a while. But if you're interested in that, stay tuned and make sure to subscribe to the channel. That's also the reason why I still haven't gotten around to answering all the questions you guys asked back in April. But don't worry, we will get there eventually. Here's the next batch, and as usual you will also see some clips from my chats with Rene Zandbergen, Lisa Fagin Davis and Yale linguist Claire Bowern. Enjoy! We'll start off with a very personal question. What made me personally interested in Voynich Manuscript? Well, I first learned about the manuscript in EOS, a Flemish science magazine. It's often found in waiting rooms, like at the doctor's office. They had an article about unsolved manuscripts, with obviously a prominent place for the Voynich. I read the article, but then forgot about it. Or so I thought. Several years later then, I came down with some mysterious viral illness that landed me in the hospital for several months. Think incessant fevers, signs of organ failure, doctors trying everything without really knowing what to do. Anyway, I clearly survived, but it took me a long time to recover. Somewhere in the aftermath, my brain still in a permanent fog, I thought, I wonder if people solved that weird book already. Turned out that they hadn't. The first things I wrote about the manuscript were really dumb. I removed many of my early posts on my research blog because they were just frankly embarrassing. In hindsight, I knew nothing about any of the disciplines involved, apart from linguistics and a bit of history maybe. But that's not enough. You need to learn things specifically about the manuscript as well, and that only comes after a while. But I stuck around and probably will keep researching this thing as long as I can find the spare time.
Have you ever had a Voynich Manuscript dream?
Well, I couldn't tell you since I almost never remember my dreams. Who knows how many times the solution has been revealed to me only to evaporate at daybreak.
Could it be a memory device similar to a Lukasa? Like Dr. Lynn Kelly argues many oral cultures used extensively, that there is no meaning encoded in the text as we would think of it, but rather that the text and pictures would prompt recollection of the actual information, which has to be learned directly from someone who knows it.
I may not recollect any Voynich dreams, but this one is a recurring nightmare of mine. Let me first clarify this term that this person uses. A Lukasa is a memory board, a mnemonic device that was used by the Luba people of the Congo. Basically, you have a board studded with colored beads and carved symbols, and their arrangement will help you recollect myths and history and legends, stuff like that. Is it possible that part of the information required to understand the manuscript was actually expected to already be in the reader's mind? So, for example, when you see this line, or this weird image, it jogs your memory enough to know, like, oh yeah, this is that text that I memorized earlier, this is this well-known story, and so that's this basic framework is enough for them to fill it in with everything that's in their minds. And I really believe that something along those lines is definitely a possibility. The reason why I call this a nightmare is that it would mean we will never be able to understand the Voynich text, since the key is information stored in the brain of someone who died 600 years ago. I could go on about this for a while, but I think it's time to move on to the next question.
One more silly question. I suppose that the proper way to abbreviate the Voynich manuscript is VMS, with lowercase s, but is acceptable to the Voynichologist community to write VMS with capital S. It is easier on the fingers and looks better, more balanced and relaxed. Could we enact that as an international Voynichology standard?
My own preferred abbreviation is just VM, that's shorter, and it's 2 words after all. So there's no reason to give the script its own letter. Of course, I know we usually abbreviate manuscript as MS, so VMS is really logical as well. Coincidentally, I asked this very question on a poll at Voynich Ninja 3 years ago. You'll be glad to know that VMS all caps won by a good margin. VMS with a small s only got 4 votes, which makes sense because it's an eyesore that looks like a typo. If I had any authority to enact Voynichology standards, my first target would be the traditional names of the manuscript's sections though, since those are really confusing, but that's a topic for another time. Next up, we have a frequently asked question. If the Voynich text is unlikely to be the result of a simple substitution cipher, then perhaps it could be a Conlang instead, a made-up, constructed language like Esperanto or Tolkien's Elven languages. This felt like an excellent question to pass on to Claire Bowern, professor of linguistics at Yale.
Right, this is consistently the favorite solution for my Voynich class members as well. I poll them at the start of the semester and then poll them regularly throughout the semester, and Conlang's often comes up as very high. I think so it's possible, of course, we know there are Conlangs from throughout recorded history. I think it's unlikely in the sense that positing a Conlang for Voynichese does not solve our problems about the statistics of the text. So I think people often propose a Conlang as a reason for why we can't get meaning out of the text or why we don't recognize the words and so on. That's partially true. But before the early 20th century, so basically before professional linguists started getting involved with constructing Conlangs and so on, Conlangs look a lot like natural languages. So we don't have a lot of well-recorded examples. I know of 3 reasonably, or 4, depending on what you say about John Dee's Enochian language.
Is there one that's early that you know of?
Yeah, so there's Hildegard's Lingua Ignota, which is about 350 words, if I remember right. It's a Conlang where the words look a lot like German phonology, but they're put in a matrix of Latin grammar. So the words are not Latin, but the case endings are Latin, the verb inflections are Latin, the syntax is Latin. Basically, all of the pre-20th century Conlangs are like that. And of course, Lingua Ignota is not designed to be a language for humans to communicate with each other. It's a language designed for Hildegard to express spiritual and religious sentiments to God. There's Balai Belen, which is, so we have attestations from the 16th century. We actually have 3 dictionaries in different parts of the world, but it's probably from somewhat earlier. It's a Sufi mystic language, which has a mixture of Persian, Turkish, and Arabic elements. So again, it's a combination of natural languages mixed together. And
kind of Esperanto-like?
Yeah, so it's more like Esperanto than I don't know how conventionalized it is. So Esperanto takes features of a whole bunch of different languages and then makes up a bunch of grammar rules. For Balai Belen, they take roots from different languages, but I think the grammar is mostly Arabic. So just like Lingua Ignota has Latin case endings and Latin syntax, Arabic, the Balai Belen has, I believe, mostly Arabic grammar. And so we have this dictionary and we have some example words and inflections and sentences. We don't have any texts or anything in Balai Belen. And then my personal favorite is Salmanazar's Formosan language. So this is later again. So we've started from Hildegard to the 16th century Sufic language. Salmanazar, I think, is mid-18th century. He was a total charlatan. So we don't know very much about him, I don't think, but basically he made a living going around the court of the English court, pretending to be from the island of Formosa and talking about his upbringing, the culture of the Formosan people, and so on. So there are a lot of publications, a lot of versions of his publications, and so on. And so he made up a Formosan language, and it's very similar to English in many ways. It has an English-based writing system, it has English phonology, it has English grammar, and so on. So it looks totally unlike the Austronesian languages that are the indigenous languages of the island of Formosa, now Taiwan. And so those are probably the best attested conlangs, and so in each case they are pretty closely related to a natural language, in that they draw very heavily on the structures and features of natural languages, and they look like natural languages for many of the statistical purposes that many of the statistical metrics that we might want to explore. Voynich's doesn't look like that. So if Voynich's is a conlang, it's very different from any of the historical conlangs we know about, which makes it, at least to me, extremely unlikely that a conlang is the solution to our problems for this.
Is there a chance that each of the letters has a certain meaning, just like Chinese characters each represent a whole word?
No, definitely not. You don't have enough letters for that. Chinese has about 2,000 to 3,000 characters just to express common vocabulary. I'm just Googling this, don't come after me if it's wrong, but it's really in the thousands rather than in the tens. That's 2 orders of magnitude greater than what the Voynich can muster. In fact, someone posted a theory like this recently at Voynich Ninja. The result was that each page of the manuscript becomes a long, meaningless string of the same few words repeated over and over, just in a different order.
This plant is very pretty plant. It pretty has red and green is pretty and green. This is pretty and its red leaves, roots is pretty and its red leaves green. This is brown. Plant green is very brown. Green is pretty tasty.
Another frequently mentioned concept in the comments is Zipf's law, but since I'm not a statistician, I decided to ask Rene Zandbergen about its relevance for the Voynich manuscript.
I mean, the idea is that if you take a text and you count the words. So every word type, you see how many times it occurs, and then you sort them from most frequent to least frequent.
Right.
Then obviously you get a line that goes down. But Zipf's law is saying something about the specific way in which it goes down. If a word appears 10 times less often, then its rank in the listing is 10 times higher. So it's basically proportional or inverse proportional. The funny thing about Zipf's law is for meaningful texts in meaningful languages is that this curve tends to flatten out a little bit at the left end. So it is not really half and 1/3 and 1/4 at the very beginning, but it is that trend later on. But for example, if you take a book that is like a dictionary, then this law doesn't actually apply, because then you have relatively more rare words, because you basically describe all the words that exists. And so if you make a graph for a thesaurus or a dictionary, you see a slightly different shape, but it still tends to flatten out a little bit in the high frequency part. The Voynich manuscript follows that, which is interesting, but it doesn't really mean a lot. It doesn't mean by itself that the text is meaningful. It probably means that it wasn't generated by a computer, but we know that. So it's not arbitrary. So it is something that was generated by a human, and it has sort of some human influence in that sense. This is probably the most one can say.
So it's more like it would be worrying, so to speak, if it didn't follow Zipf's law, but the fact that it does follow Zipf's law doesn't really tell us anything much.
Not too much. That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah. It does tell us that it's probably not a dictionary, but we would have seen that probably.
We would have noticed that in other ways, yeah.
Can we trace the paper's DNA for relate it with the allegedly disappeared part of the book?
It is possible to extract DNA information from parchment, since it was once part of a living animal. This is part of the emerging discipline of biocodicology. You can find out the species and even try to determine which herd the animal came from. That would be handy since it would provide us with more geographical information. Of course, this would require a large database of DNA sampled from many different manuscripts, which doesn't exist yet as far as I know. And even if it did, we would have to get very lucky to find a match. I don't quite see how that would get us any closer to the missing pages, though. We know for sure that pages have been removed from the manuscript at some point. But there are millions of parchment pages around the world. We must have a better means to find any missing Voynich pages than to test all parchment we find for DNA. Like, just visually inspecting them for any Voynichese writing or weird nymphs.
I'd like to submit this question. Are you from the Netherlands?
No, I most definitely am not. I'm from Flanders, the northern part of Belgium. People from Flanders and the Netherlands speak a variety of different dialects of Dutch. If I actually were from the Netherlands, my outrageous accent would be slightly different. For me, it's pretty easy to tell a Flemish person and a Dutch person apart by the way they speak English. But we also have a few things in common. For example, Dutch, like several other European languages, has no th sound. So unless we are really trying our best, we'll replace it with a T or a D. The number 3 and a tree sound basically the same to us. We also have a very strong tendency to devoice word final consonants. Now, if you want to compare the way I speak to the way a Dutch person speaks English, then, for example, just look up a speech by NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. And I sincerely hope you will hear a difference in my favor.
On another of your videos, someone wrote that it was done by some German living in South Tyrol or thereabouts. What do you think about that theory? It looked really good to me.
When people think about where the manuscript may have been written, there are just a few factors that come into consideration. One is the infamous castle on the Rosette's page, with its characteristic swallowtail merlins. Battlements like these were found all over Italy, up to the southern Alps, but at least before 1450, not above the Alps. So the person who drew this must have been familiar with Italian architecture. In addition to that, some of the Voynich images, like the full-page plant drawings, may also have been based on Italian examples. On the other hand, though, the style of the zodiac figures looks more northern, and we find German language inscriptions in the manuscript, including apparent color annotations in a handful of plants. So people see part of the evidence pulling them south of the Alps, but another pulling to the north. Hence, Tyrol is one of the logical locations to land, as well as other German-speaking regions relatively close to Italy. That said, there is really no definitive answer to the location question. People in the early 15th century moved around a lot, especially students and highly educated people, so I think the question of where it was made may not be the most helpful one. Instead, we may ask what the makers must have been familiar with, what their influences were.
What's the most interesting tidbit about the manuscript that isn't very well known, in your opinion?
Oh, there are just too many to choose from. When you say tidbit, I think of something small, so how about a hidden bug? Apart from the manuscript's main herbal section with full-page plant drawings, there's this other section with hundreds of smaller items in rows next to what looks like ornate vessels. All of these items appear to be plant parts, with just two exceptions. This bluish cube of whatever that is, and this frog. And that's what we thought for decades. Until Rene Zandbergen shared this image of Theodore Peterson's 1930s handwritten copy of the page. Next to a frog, there's something else, which appears to have legs and a head and a tail. However, if we compare this exact area to the 2004 Beinecke scans, we see that there's nothing there. So what's up with that? In the higher quality scans made in 2014, what looks like an extra leaf has now appeared from under the fold. There are hints of legs, but it's all still a bit puzzling how Peterson got this whole critter out of this. So some months ago I obtained a close-up picture of this thing from the actual manuscript, and it does appear like the frog had a hidden buddy. In true Voynich fashion, of course, it's some kind of a freak of nature with a long tail and a huge stinger on its nose or whatever that is. So congratulations, you're now one of the few people to know that there's a weird whatever hidden in the folds of this 600-year-old book.
Are we pretty certain that there were multiple scribes involved in making the manuscript?
It is, I believe, extremely likely based on my own understanding and my own background as a paleographer. So let's start with that, right? I want to make sure that that's crystal clear, that I am not presenting this as an absolute fact. It is evidence highly supported, a theory highly supported by the evidence. So let's start there. If you think about modern handwriting forensic analysis, like you would use in a court of law, the way that works is that everyone's handwriting is unique in some way because we are all humans. We are not machines. When you write the alphabet, whatever alphabet you use, you are going, no matter how much you try to imitate someone else's handwriting, there will always be something that is distinct about your handwriting. And that's the basic tenet of paleography as a field, is that every human throughout history who has ever picked up a writing implement and written on a writing surface has something unique about their handwriting. And so for the Voynich, what I set out to do was to figure out where those unique elements are. And what that means is it's about tendencies. It's not, no one writes every letter the same way every time because we are humans. And so, but you're looking for tendencies. In medieval Latin, the ampersand, the abbreviation for et, at, or in English, and, is a tell for different scribes. No matter how careful you are, the way you write an ampersand happens to be one of those things that, at least in certain time periods, is very unique and specific. Punctuation is another thing to look at, and abbreviation marks. So those are some of the things that I look for when I'm working on a medieval manuscript and I'm trying to distinguish different hands.
You say some characters are more likely to have a tell than others. Is that because they're maybe rarer, less grounded?
It's almost the opposite. It's that they're characters that people don't necessarily put a lot of thought into when you're writing. If you're trying to write quickly, for example, you don't necessarily take the time to write a question mark really carefully. You're just zipping through in your writing. Rare characters, certainly, like in Italy, for example, in Italian manuscripts, the letter Z is rare, but very unique. It's rare, but not unique in Northern Europe, in the handwritings in Northern Europe. So it also varies depending on where you are. And I'm only talking about Europe because that's my area of expertise. Yeah. If you're looking at European hands, there are some letter forms that are useful for English manuscripts, others that are useful in Italy or France or Germany. So you sort of have to get to know those strategies as you have developed more experience looking at manuscripts. And I'll say one more thing, which is paleography also, in addition to distinguishing hands, is also extremely useful in medieval Europe for determining the date and place when a manuscript was written, because of the way that handwriting and the writing the Latin out letters develops over time. Yes. So I am trained as a paleographer to tell you by looking at a medieval manuscript, is it from France? Is it from Italy? Is it from the 12th century? Is it from the 15th century? So all of those things factor into the discipline of paleography. So what I set out to do with the Voynich was looking at the whole corpus of letters across the manuscript, try and get a handle on which letter forms are tells. So speaking EVA, there was one letter in particular that is really, really useful, and that's the N at the end of a word, where it has that flourish that loops back. That is really distinctive from scribe to scribe. You have to have more than just the one letter form. I also looked at K, and I looked at F also, which is the other gallows with one leg and one loop. But it turned out to, there are some differences, but it's not as useful. But N is really a really great signifier for distinguishing the work of one scribe from another. In the Voynich 2, scribe 1 and scribe 2, which were the ones that Currier initially distinguished in the herbal section, are very clearly different hands. When you just looking at them sort of from far away, you can see really, you can see really clearly. So, well, like here's an example right here. So what scribe 1 is really spread out. It's neater. You might say it's more legible. It's easier to transcribe, although scribe 1 does have a lot of errors, a lot of very strange forms that seem to be mistakes. And scribe 2 is very cramped and crowded. And when you put them next to one another, you can see with the naked eye how different they are. But those distinctions elsewhere in the manuscript, when you add in these other scribes, are a little bit more difficult to see. But when you start looking at that individual letter form at the N in particular, it is really quite distinctive.
So you basically built up from the ground a system for doing that for the Voynich, as if it would be a regular writing system.
Yes, exactly. Sort of applying the methodologies that I use in Latin medieval manuscripts, applying that to the Voynich.
Okay.
Exactly.
Now, I've noticed that not necessarily academics, but still people with some experience in Voynich research, they're kind of repulsed by this idea that there might be more than one scribes. You've noticed that, right?
Sure. Oh, yes, I have.
and I think it might be more so than with other claims. But why do you think this might be the case? That this in particular is something people don't really. Well, I mean, I think in general there's an acceptance of your findings. I mean, I don't want to portray this the wrong way, but still there's quite a number of people who oppose it strongly. Why do you think that might be the case?
Well, because it immediately makes it very difficult to argue that the manuscript is the work of just one person, or that it is, whether that one person is a 16th century cryptologist, genius, whomever, who is writing in code, or someone who is mentally unstable, who is just writing gibberish and nonsense. And so my work, not only in identifying these scribes, but mapping their work onto the codicological structure of the manuscript, makes it extremely difficult to make the case that the entire manuscript is written by one person. That flies in the face of a lot of theories. And so if you accept my work, then you have to accept that the manuscript is the work of a group of people, not just...
Which one can still kind of nudge in the way one likes, but maybe not to the extent that some people would prefer.
Exactly.